I think it would be less contained than Iraq. Is against a bigger country. It's a more geostrategic positioning and scale of country. If you had the worst case scenario of a complete breakdown there, the implications for the region could be pretty catastrophic. And I think all the players in the region feel that, all of Iran's neighbours feel that. As I say, I make the exception of Israel because an Iran in a state of chaos may be seen as less threatening to Israel, and therefore that might be something that they would want to see as a not necessarily as a worst case. And therefore, if the US does get involved in military action, you might see Israel joining in with maybe slightly different objectives.
Hello and welcome to the Middle East Report, your one-stop shop for all the news and analysis coming out of the region. And I'm your host, Iran Rob. President Trump has delivered a 10-day ultimatum to Iran, telling them that they must make a deal or really bad things will happen. So, the question is, are we on the brink of war? Let's speak to Rob Macaire, who was the British ambassador to Tehran for 3 years, about 5-6 years ago. Hello to you, Rob.
Good afternoon.
Starting then, first of all, with that question, how close are we now to war in Iran?
Well, it feels increasingly likely, doesn't it? This military buildup is huge. I don't think it's necessarily inevitable, because I think that it's likely that President Trump would prefer to get an agreement if he could get a deal that was seen to be better than what his predecessors had got, if that was perceived in the US, in the region, and in Iran itself as being a better deal. But that would look like the sort of capitulation that I think the Iranian regime is unlikely to give. And so it feels like that deal is unlikely, and therefore we are on a trajectory towards fairly imminent military action.
You mentioned the build-up. I mean, the build-up is huge. By my understanding, we now have a second aircraft carrier going into the region. The Israelis have sort of heightened their alert systems. The US have requested the use of the RAF Fairford base in Gloucestershire. It does feel like there is a level of build-up, and some analysts are saying it is the biggest build-up of US military in the region since Iraq in 2003. Is that your estimation too?
I think that's right, although of course it's difficult to compare because that involved ground troops, and no one's talking about ground invasions of Iran.
So when we talk about this base first, or if we go back to the US requesting the use of the UK base, the Foreign Secretary has said in the last few hours that she thinks it's important that the US go ahead and make a deal, and she wouldn't reference, but she did hint at the idea that potentially the US were using the Chagos deal as leverage on the use of this base for Iran. Now, why would the US need the use of the Gloucestershire base in any sort of attack on Iran?
Well, first, I'm not privy to any of the discussions that are going on in private between the US and UK, but I've seen those reports. And quite often when the US is contemplating some sort of action in the Middle East, there are issues around UK basing, be it in UK or in the region, or sometimes Cyprus, and often a discussion about Diego Garcia as well. And these are often quite complicated discussions. And one of the things that the UK, under governments of both parties, has always been pretty clear about is the primacy of international legality and the importance of that in granting permission for use of bases.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. How big a deal do you put it in your summation, I suppose, on the use of these bases? And I suppose, how big a deal is it that the UK is saying, look, well, this might break international law, and the UK wasn't involved last time around in the last attack the US did. So in your view, do you think the UK's position on this is right, and the position that they've taken, which is that this, us taking part would essentially be a breach of international law?
I don't think that that's what the UK government is saying so directly, and I think these are quite complicated issues around what's legal and what isn't. Obviously, the justifications for the use of military force in international law are largely around either Security Council authorization or self-defense, and those are the main justifications for the use of military force. And the UK government, if it's being asked this, will be thinking about whether this action would fall into those categories or not. And that's not necessarily an easy judgment to make when it comes to self-defense, because it depends on the intent, and it depends on the situation. and that's something that government lawyers will be looking at. But also, I mean, I think if you look at the way that President Trump has used American military might, he hasn't been keen to do this as multilateral activity. He's quite keen to show the US's unilateral military strength. And if you look at the attacks on Iran last June, those were B-2s that flew across from the continental US, an extraordinary operation. So I don't think that it would make sense to sort of blow the UK role in this out of proportion.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you about that. In the instance that America does go ahead now, we've just had this tariff ruling in the last few hours in America, and there's been a suggestion, at least from some analysts, that because of the nature of this ruling, it could mean that President Trump then acts in a way more aggressively to Iran over the weekend. Now that's it's hard to prove, and it's certainly just a suggestion. But if the UK was to get pulled in, is there any scope, I suppose, in the UK getting pulled in? Is what I'm asking.
If there's military action between the US and Iran, then there's always a risk of the UK being pulled in, because these conflicts can escalate pretty rapidly. The UK has assets in the region that could be hit, so the UK doesn't necessarily have a choice of standing to one side, and of course traditionally has a strong alliance with the US and with other important players in the region as well. The UK will be closely involved in discussions about this. I think it's difficult to predict where it's going to go. And I think when you talk about the relationship between the Supreme Court ruling and action in the Middle East, this link between foreign policy actions and domestic controversies is something that people speculate a lot about in the US. But even if the president does have an incentive to maybe change the news agenda and to distract from domestic issues, this is something that's very bound up with military preparations, and there are military timelines involved in this which are complicated and expensive. So the freedom of manoeuvre is not absolute there for the president. He's got to take a decision, and I think he has built this up. He's been very public about it. He's issued very public threats, and therefore he's in a position where he's going to be compelled to take action if he doesn't get some sort of deal that can show a justification for not doing so. And then it'll come to a question of what that military action looks like and what it leads to, which I think is very, very uncertain.
And so, if now we're in a place where, from the US perspective at least, and we'll talk about Iran in a minute, but from the US perspective, they decide to go in. Is there, in your assessment and of the region, in your understanding of the people there, is there any likelihood that he achieves a singular goal? Say if you take regime change as the goal, and which the US president a few days ago said that it's something that he thought was a good idea, or he hinted at that. Is that a realistic objective, do you think, from your knowledge of Iran and your time there?
I think it's very difficult to bomb any country into democracy. I think if you use enough military force with a regime that is as troubled and as lacking in legitimacy as the Iranian regime, if you use enough force, you can probably destabilize it. But the difficulty is, and this is assuming that the objective is regime change of any action rather than containment or just specific action on things like ballistic missiles. But if the objective is regime change, then I think the problem is that it's quite hard to take action that collapses the regime without also collapsing state authority and leading to chaos and a really dysfunctional situation inside the country, which is not in the interests of the region or the Iranian people.
And would it be worse if, for example, there was a stated dysfunction in the country? Would that, from a US lens or from a more Western lens of the way it's being viewed, would that be seen as better or worse than what's currently there? Because obviously we have seen the protests in the last few months and, scenes of absolute barbarism. But is there a sense that would be better or worse from a sort of foreign policy point of view? Is that the sort of question being weighed up, I suppose, in capitals in London and in Washington?
Yeah, and I don't think anyone would be able to tell you what's going to happen and what any particular action is going to lead to. But there clearly is a risk of a serious breakdown in the country if it's destabilized. That does not necessarily lead to a better regime either for the Iranian people or for the neighborhood or for, as you put it, Western interests. if there is a Syria-type breakdown inside Iran, the population is 3 times the size of Syria. The refugee impacts for Europe would be very significant. But I think more significant would be the ungoverned space and the extremism and terrorist risk and the risk of organized crime and the destabilization that would come out of Iran if it were to be in that sort of internal conflict, which is not definitely in Western interests. I think one of the complicating factors is that it may be seen by the government in Israel as being not such a bad outcome to get to.
Yeah, I mean, that was my final question. I mean, there are certain states, I mean, the Gulf states are urging the US not to get involved. And then Israel has obviously been teetering on the edge of wanting this for a long time. That's no surprise. But in terms of the way it's viewed in the wider sort of geopolitic of the region, would you see the same sort of fallout you saw in Iraq? Or is this sort of a different case and it would be more isolated and contained?
I think it would be less contained than Iraq is against a bigger country. It's a more geostrategic positioning and scale of country. If you had the worst case scenario of the complete breakdown there, the implications for the region could be pretty catastrophic. And I think all the players in the region feel that, all of Iran's neighbours feel that. As I say, I make the exception of Israel because an Iran in a state of chaos may be seen as less threatening to Israel, and therefore that might be something that they would want to see as a not necessarily as a worst case. And therefore, if the US does get involved in military action, you might see Israel joining in with maybe slightly different objectives.
Rob Macaire, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.